Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 116, The Third Punic War, Dido's Lament. After being pushed to the edge by the increasingly impossible demands of the Roman Senate, the Carthaginians had reached their breaking point. They would not submit themselves to a fate that would see the withering away of their society, but instead chose to stand and fight against the power of the Roman Republic, perhaps hoping to give one last black eye to their Italian foes who were equally determined to bring about their destruction. After murdering or expelling any Roman sympathizers in the city, the Carthaginians went to work to prepare themselves for the inevitable onslaught that followed their rejection of the ultimatum posed by the consuls in 149. They unfortunately found themselves on the back foot, having already handed over most of their weapons and armors as part of an earlier negotiation with the Romans, and their defeat in the war with Massinissa made a major dent in their fighting capability. Yet they were undeterred, and a vigorous attempt to rebuild their arsenal took place. According to Appian and Strabo, many parts of the city were converted into full-time workshops, which produced up to 140 shields, 300 swords, 500 spears, 500 javelins, and 1,000 catapult missiles each day. To replenish their depleted navy, the Punic shipwrights feverishly worked day and night, using stored lumber and materials scavenged from houses to construct 120 ships in less than 2 months. The women of Carthage also took part in the preparations, many of them angry mothers of the children that were sent into Roman captivity, who offered to melt down their jewelry to be used in munitions factories in lieu of bronze or iron, and even donated their long hair so it could be spun into rope for catapults and ship rigging. A message was sent to recall Hasdrubal from exile to lead the Carthaginian army, whose numbers were bolstered by waves of volunteers and the enrollment of slaves that received freedom in return for service, which amounted to 30,000 men operating in the field away from the city. Evidently, the consuls Censorinus and Manilius had allowed all of this to transpire rather than take the initiative and attack the Carthaginians while they were still unprepared. Appian has no explanation for this, wondering aloud if it was due to arrogance or the mistaken belief of the Romans that Carthage would not seriously consider standing their ground when in such a compromising position. The betrayal of Utica to the Roman cause gave them a convenient port less than 11 miles from the city, and the amount of manpower summoned, even if we believe it to be 40 to 50,000 rather than the claimed 80,000, was more than enough to conquer one city. The Numidians would be able to provide support, but King Massinissa was apparently annoyed by the presence of the Romans to begin with. He felt that the Roman invasion robbed him of the glory of subjugating the Carthaginians, and it seems like the consuls picked up on this dissatisfaction. When asked if he would give assistance, Massinissa responded that he would send it whenever he should see that they needed it, but the Romans sharply replied that they would send for him whenever they needed him. Despite these advantages, actually capturing the city was a different story. Neither Agathocles of Syracuse, Marcus Attilius Regulus, nor even Scipio Africanus placed Carthage under siege when they undertook their North African expeditions. It was an incredibly fortified site, which had only grown in size and strength in the subsequent decades after these earlier events. According to Appian, likely echoing Polybius's account, the city's peninsular location gave it a natural defense on its eastward side, with a single wall facing the sea, while its land-facing side on the western end was reinforced by a triple line of defense and a narrow isthmus. The innermost was a massive stone wall measuring up to 20 meters, or 66 feet in height, lined with towers, then followed by a ditch, and lastly a wooden palisade running from north to south to barricade the city. On the southern end was its harbor, the famed Kothon that could be sealed off using an enormous iron chain, and the adjacent strip of land was bordered by the Lake of Tunis. At the center of Carthage was the Bursa, its fortified citadel surrounded by residential and commercial districts. It would have been an intimidating prospect for anyone to attempt a siege of it, But time was running out for the consuls who sought the glory of conquering an old enemy before their terms were up. The attack started in earnest when the consuls divided their tasks. Manilius was to march from inland towards the isthmus and oversee a crossing of the triple defensive line by filling up ditches and setting ladders upon the largest walls, while Censorinus tried to ferry his troops from the south by scaling the walls using ladders mounted on ships. But both were surprised to learn of the ferocious resistance put up by the Carthaginians and forced to retreat. Again they tried, and again they were bested, much to the delight of the defenders who felt increasingly confident in their ability to stave off the Roman tide. Each consul decided to encamp in different areas, Censorinus facing the southern wall next to the lake, while Manilius took over the isthmus. But Hasdrubal and his army were stationed on the opposite bank of the lake to shadow the Romans. Here the consular army was once more beset with difficulties, with a third failed attempt to scale the city walls in conjunction with the raid by Hannibal Barca, one of Hasdrubal's cavalry commanders, against a Roman foraging party. Eventually, Censorinus was able to construct 2 large battering rams, each so massive that it required 6,000 men to help move and guard it, and this time they were more successful in making openings in the southern wall. They were unable to get inside though, as Carthaginians swarmed the breaches and drove off the Romans from getting into the city. In the cover of darkness, they tried their best to repair the damage, but for good measure, they sent forth a band of attackers carrying firebrands to destroy the siege equipment and raid the Roman camp. Panic set in as the rams burned brightly through the darkness, but through the quick thinking of the attending tribune, Scipio Aemilianus, the Carthaginians were forced back after he rallied his cavalrymen to charge the raiders from behind, and wisely he restrained his men from chasing too far into the city. The attack may have been halted, but the damage was done, and the Romans were once again left right where they started. As the Romans tried to gather themselves after the setback, the consuls faced additional problems. By July of 149, Censorinus' camp was being ravaged by disease, given its unfavorable position, and so was forced to move to a new area. Unfortunately, they were further aggravated by continuous raids by Hannibal Barca and the occasional fire ships sent out from the Carthaginians to burn the Roman fleet when the wind was in their favor, destroying several ships in each attempt. Looking to make any sort of progress, Manilius assembled an expedition to confront Hasdrubal's army, who were encamped to the southeast in the region of Nepharis. Scipio warned his superior about the problems of the terrain and the security of the Carthaginian position, but his concerns were dismissed, and the march proceeded as planned. This required a river crossing, and as a result, the disorganized legionaries were set upon by Hasdrubal's men, who managed to slaughter several of the tribunes. Scipio was able to facilitate the crossing by harassing the Carthaginian troops, limiting the number of casualties that otherwise could have befallen the Romans. Manilius made little progress, and ultimately had to retreat, but some of the Romans had been cut off and surrounded on a nearby hill. A rescue party was then organized by Scipio and was successfully able to draw them into safety, and he even managed to broker a small truce with Hasdrubal to organize the burial of the fallen tribunes. Scipio increasingly demonstrated himself as the most competent of the commanders in the African expedition, which had turned out to be a far greater challenge than what Roman arrogance anticipated. The rest of 149 passed without any further progress, with Censorinus' term as consul almost up, and during the early months of 148, he launched another desperate attack against Hasdrubal's position in Nepharis, but came out of it empty-handed. In the meanwhile, Aemilianus was sent to Massinissa' capital to recruit Prince Galusa into the war effort, and he also managed to establish contact with Hannibal Barca, who admitted an interest in betraying the Carthaginians to take up arms with the Romans, as long as his safety was guaranteed. Eventually this was arranged, and Phammeus brought with him 2,200 cavalrymen to Manilius's camp to be escorted back to Rome, accompanied by Scipio, and the Senate showered the Carthaginian with gifts of gilded armor and money, elated at the first bit of positive news they have heard so far. The year 148 was also marked by a period of relative inactivity. Rome continued its blockade, now under the command of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who replaced Manilius as the sole consul leading the African campaign. Rather than have the legions beating their heads against the walls of Carthage, Piso launched attacks against the allied settlements like Aspis and Hippogretta, but this proved to be as impotent an attempt as the previous year, with nothing to show for his efforts. Even in light of Phammeus' defection, spirits remained high in Carthage due to their successes in the field. They were able to point to their victories in the deputations sent to the various Numidian tribes to try and sway them to join their cause, with one chief named Biphia betraying Gulusa and taking with him 800 riders. In contrast, the Roman people were increasingly desolate at the lack of any real progress being made across 2 seasons of campaigning. Again, the only man of distinction was Scipio Aemilianus, and soon enough it came time for the election of the new consuls. At the age of 36, Scipio was eligible as candidate for the position of aedile, but some felt that he should be granted far greater powers to help bring the war to a speedier end. Many of the plebeians and even some of the senators were inclined to go against the established cursus honorum and elect Scipio as consul. Most men would be unable to campaign for the position until they reached 40 years of age, but these were desperate times, and the decision to disregard the age limits had a precedent with Scipio Africanus, who was elected when he was only 31. The attractive parallel of sending another Scipio to Africa could not be denied, and even Cato, a bitter enemy of Scipio Africanus and his kin, was quite complimentary towards the young Aemilianus, stating that among all the others fighting in Africa, he, and he only, has sense. The rest are mere flickering shadows. Despite some initial resistance, one of the tribunes of the plebs was able to leverage his power of veto to encourage the Senate to repeal the law of age requirements for just 1 year, and Scipio was elected as consul and commander of the war against Carthage, followed by a wave of new recruits eagerly enlisting to serve alongside their prospective savior. As Scipio prepared to sail with his new reinforcements in early 147, the Romans already in Libya actually managed to get some sort of momentum. The admiral of the fleet, Lucius Hostilius Mancinus, approached a wall of Carthage that, due to being shielded by the intimidatingly large cliffs, was neglected by the city's guards. As the legionaries scaled ladders to reach the exposed area, the Carthaginians caught wind of their plans and poured out of the nearby gate to confront them. They faced a fierce resistance and were actually beaten back by the attackers, who stormed through the very same gate, and for the first time, the Romans achieved a foothold inside of Carthage itself. Mancinus looked to capitalize on the opportunity and ordered as many men to go inside as possible, including unarmed sailors just to bolster their numbers. However, they now faced the problem of being trapped in their position without supplies, and the distinct possibility that the Carthaginians would drive them over the cliffs into the sea once they regrouped. Thankfully, Scipio had by this point landed in Utica and learned of the admiral's predicament, so he directed his ships to sail to Carthage and scare off the Carthaginian militia, allowing for the rescue of the beleaguered Romans. With that debacle out of the way, Scipio relieved the consul Piso of his command, encamping just outside of the city's limits while being shadowed by Hasdrubal's army, who were also positioned near the walls. The Carthaginians had been informed of Scipio's impending arrival, and were likely on high alert, given that he was the mastermind behind many of their setbacks. One of the first things he did was reinforce discipline in the Roman camps by purging the army of any freebooters, criminals, or other unruly followers who might have sapped the fighting potential of the legions. Having scared the soldiery with his no-nonsense attitude, he immediately took the initiative by launching a 2-pronged night attack against the Megara, a neighborhood of Carthage that lay north of the Byrsa. By distracting the enemy from two different positions, this allowed Scipio to approach an undefended tower and have some of his group scurry over the walls and open the gates. Nearly 4,000 legionaries were now inside the city walls, and while many Carthaginians fled to the Barca in panic, Scipio did not feel comfortable navigating through an unfamiliar layout and risk being caught in an ambush in the darkness, so he carefully led his troops back the way he came. Though Scipio was no closer to taking the city, the Carthaginians were deeply unnerved by the whole incident, feeling a sense of vulnerability that had not been present for most of the war. Hasdrubal, meanwhile, was furious over both the failure of the defenders and the infectious fear of the rest of the population. To dissuade against any would-be deserters or traitors, Hasdrubal gathered the Roman prisoners of war they captured and brought them to the top of the city walls. In full view of the Roman camp, these unlucky men were tortured in a gruesome variety of ways, then were tossed to their deaths. This actually worsened morale among the citizenry, since any chance of a merciful surrender may very well have been destroyed by this atrocity, and the few brave members of the Carthaginian Senate who criticized their acting commander for his tyrannical methods were swiftly executed as well, with Hasdrubal taking a much more Machiavellian approach to ensure the remainder would follow his orders out of fear. Now that Hasdrubal had retreated back inside of the city and could no longer launch attacks from the field, Scipio burned the old Carthaginian camp and set about digging a series of trenches stretching across the isthmus along with fortified palisades. His troops faced a great deal of pushback from the Punic defenders as they labored to get the job done, but were ultimately successful, meaning that the city was entirely cut off from any reinforcements or supplies from overland. Their only lifeline was now the sea, and while a few Carthaginian ships managed to break through the naval blockade on occasion, food became increasingly scarce, most of it being reserved for Hasdrubal and his soldiers, while many citizens began to starve by the summer of 147. Even worse, Scipio had already begun the process of sealing off the harbor by constructing an artificial mole across the waters using heavy stones, a similar feat achieved by Alexander at Tyre. Driven by the fear of starvation, the Carthaginians put their newfound energy to work by digging around the clock a new entrance for the harbor in the city's interior, along with the construction of new ships using wood recycled from old structures. None of the Romans had any real idea of what was going on beyond the noise of their activity, since the Carthaginians were keen to conceal their efforts. But one morning, about 50 Punic ships made their way out of the harbor into the bay to the astonishment of Scipio's army. No attack upon the Romans was made during this initial demonstration, but 3 days later, presumably after training the Carthaginian sailors, these ships set out once again, eager for a fight. The smaller triremes managed to perform admirably against the larger Roman ships without taking any casualties, but during their withdrawal back into Carthage, they accidentally created a traffic jam at the mouth of the harbor. They were now sitting ducks for the Roman fleet to ram, and though they inflicted a great amount of damage against their attackers, they were unable to hold their ground as the last remnants of the famed Carthaginian navy sank to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Carthage was now cut off by both land and sea, and Scipio did not waste time in assaulting the walls of the harbor with battering rams and other equipment brought across the new mole. The following evening, a few brave Carthaginians plunged into the water and swam towards the Roman camp, carrying dry torches that they subsequently lit and threw upon the idle siege engines. Such was the ferocity of their surprise attack that a few of the legionaries started to panic and flee in terror, which forced Scipio to order that any man who refused to fight be slain where he stood, and actually carried out this threat to prove his point. By the morning, the smoldering remains of the destroyed artillery were all that was left, allowing the Carthaginians to rebuild parts of the wall that had been damaged and add new towers. These were then attacked by a vengeful Aemilianus, and through the use of incendiaries, he was able to drive the Punic defenders from the walls, allowing him to refortify the landing bridge with large stone defenses that protected nearly 4,000 troops, a process that carried him from the late summer to early fall of 147. With their position secure, Scipio left the siege during the winter months to focus on the remaining Carthaginians in the field, still occupying the area of Nephrus, and commanded by Hasdrubal's successor Diogenes. Gulusa and the Numidians were tasked with harassing Diogenes' men, while Scipio would lead an attack against the walls of the Punic camp, as the Romans leapt through the main breach and slaughtered many of the startled troops inside, numbering, according to Appian, 70,000 men and non-combatants. Having now lost its field army, the Carthaginians were beyond all aid, with their allied communities putting down their arms and submitting themselves to the Romans. Carthage, meanwhile, continued to starve throughout the rest of the winter into early 146, as all supplies ceased to come through, subjecting its population to further torment and weakening the resolve to continue the fight. The final phase of the war commenced with the onset of spring, for Scipio committed to laying siege to break into the inner Kothon harbor. Hasdrubal apparently wanted to deprive the Romans the opportunity to do so, and he ordered several of the wooden structures in the area to be put to the torch. But during the commotion, a Roman officer by the name of Gaius Laelius had led his own group over the defenses and seized control of that very same harbor from under their noses. This snowballed into the Romans breaking through that wall and finally getting a permanent foothold in the city proper. Nightfall passed, and by the morning, Scipio brought in fresh troops to relieve the exhausted men. But these eager soldiers greedily took it upon themselves to plunder a gold-rich temple of Apollo in direct violation of their commander's orders. Their appetites whetted with the first taste of the city's plunder, the legionaries were prepared to embark on the most gruesome portion of the war thus far. Many of the Carthaginians had fled to the citadel of the Bursa in the chaos following the loss of the harbor, and the only way to reach it was a series of 3 streets that led up to its elevated position. These roads wouldn't be so easily passed through, as they were flanked by densely populated multi-story buildings that gave vantage points to many of the defenders to throw missiles at the vulnerable Roman troops. To get to the Bursa, the legionaries would have to clear each dwelling of its occupants, building by building, undergoing a long and bloody round of urban warfare. The screams of the dying echoed across the cityscape for several days, as the Romans slaughtered in fury anyone who dared get in their way, cutting them down with their swords or throwing them off the top of the roofs to their deaths on the streets below. This included the old and the young, who had been unable to make it to the citadel and meekly tried to hide under their beds or in closets. Any non-combatants who somehow escaped the rape and pillaging found themselves burned alive or crushed by their crumbling homes, as Scipio ordered the buildings to be torched to allow for the rubble to be cleared away and give an opening for his soldiers to push forward. For 6 days and 6 nights, this horror show took place. Roman troops had to be regularly relieved of duty to cope with the physical and psychological toll of systematically destroying such an enormous city, and Scipio himself barely slept or ate. Appian, relying on the eyewitness testimony of our longtime companion Polybius of Megalopolis, who was part of Scipio's entourage, paints a nightmarish scene showing the logistics of clearing through a densely populated ancient settlement. Quote, "Nor was this the end of their miseries, for the street cleaners, who were removing the rubbish with axes, mattocks, and forks, and making the roads passable, tossed with these instruments the dead and the living together into holes in the ground, dragging them along like sticks and stones, and turning them over with their iron tools. Trenches were filled with men, some who were thrown in head foremost, with their legs sticking out of the ground, writhed a long time. Others fell with their feet downward and their heads above ground. Horses ran over them, crushing their faces and skulls, not purposely on the part of the riders, but in their headlong haste. Nor did the street cleaners do these things on purpose, but the tug of war, the glory of approaching victory, the rush of the soldiery, the orders of the officers, the blast of the trumpets, tribunes and centurions marching their cohorts hither and thither, altogether made everybody frantic and heedless of the spectacles under their eyes." End quote. It was not until the seventh and final day that the Carthaginians had enough, sending forth supplicants to carry olive branches to Scipio's camp, begging him to spare the lives of those occupying the Bursa in return for their surrender. An exhausted Aemilianus readily accepted the proposition, allowing the 50,000 men, women, and children who were stationed there to enter Roman custody. This included Hasdrubal, who made a personal submission to Scipio, much to the dismay of his own wife. In a widely repeated anecdote, she and her 2 children had descended the roof of the temple of Asclepius, inside of which roared a great fire. Dressed in her finest clothes, she cursed Hasdrubal's cowardice and declared that she would die before being paraded in a Roman triumph, and then leapt into the flames with her children in hand. So ended the Third Punic War, and with it the once great city of Carthage, nearly 700 years after its legendary foundation. The fires continued to burn for many days as Scipio rewarded his victorious soldiers by giving them permission to plunder any movable wealth, barring any precious metals and temple items. Reportedly, he is said to have found many works of art that were looted from the Greek cities of Sicily in centuries past, and so he offered the Greeks the opportunity to reclaim their stolen treasures. The rest was sold off, and Aemilianus threw the arms and equipment of the Carthaginians on a dedicatory pyre to Minerva and Mars in honor of his success. In one of the most famous anecdotes of Roman history, Scipio was said to have gazed upon the smoldering ruins of Carthage in deep contemplation. Attending at his side was our longtime companion Polybius, who noticed that his friend had burst into tears upon the sight, and when asked why, Polybius recorded the following response. Quote, "After meditating by himself a long time and reflecting on the rise and falls of cities, nations, and empires, as well as of individuals, upon the fate of Troy, that once proud city, upon that of the Assyrians, the Medes, and the Persians, greatest of all, and later the splendid Macedonian Empire, either voluntarily or otherwise, the words of Homer escaped Scipio's lips. The day shall come in which our sacred Troy, and Priam, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priam rules, shall perish all." Being asked by Polybius in familiar conversation, for Polybius had been his tutor, what he meant by using these words, he said that Scipio did not hesitate to frankly name his own country, for whose fate he feared when he considered the mutability of human affairs, and Polybius wrote this down just as he had heard it. End quote. Scipio did not lament the fate of the Carthaginians that he had brought to pass, but instead was afraid of the downfall of his own beloved city of Rome, the inevitable destiny of all great empires. Though this would not come to pass for another 600 years, or 1500 if we count the fall of Constantinople, many later Romans considered the destruction of their great Punic rivals as a turning point for the fate of the Republic, as a general sense of moral decline following the loss of an opponent near equal in strength became a cause for concern in the wake of the civil wars and the destabilization of Roman society as a whole. Yet for the moment there was celebration, for when word of Scipio's victory made its way to Rome, the citizens gathered outside in huge numbers and cheered over the gruesome demise of their hated neighbors. A senatorial commission of 10 men was dispatched to Africa to ultimately decide the fate of the city. They ordered that Carthage was to be razed to the ground, though the fires that had burned already for many days had took care of most of the structures. While an oft-repeated claim, the Romans did not in fact salt the earth around Carthage, a legend probably manufactured through the lens of much later Christian scholars who compared it to acts performed in the Old Testament. It is likely that the city was ritualistically cursed by dragging a plow around the city walls as a final mark of its obliteration, and the former lands of Carthage were not to be cultivated for almost a century. We have a few scant references to the survivors of the city's destruction. According to the sources, roughly 50,000 Carthaginians living in the city surrendered themselves to Scipio, and the typical fate for a defeated party would be enslavement, But it is strange that not one of them explicitly mentions that they were sold into captivity. Neither are we told what had happened to the hundreds of Carthaginian children taken into Roman custody in the build-up to the war. However, the orator Cicero states that many Carthaginian slaves lived in Rome during the latter half of the 2nd century, so it would be not surprising that at least some of them were given this unfortunate fate, but otherwise we are not certain. In spite of leading the resistance against the Romans, the commander Hasdrubal was spared as promised by Scipio Aemilianus, and he retired somewhere in Italy following the end of the war, though without his wife and children. Clitomachus, formerly Hasdrubal, a notable Carthaginian philosopher and pupil of Carneades the skeptic, had been living in Athens when he had heard destruction of his hometown. In consolation, he penned a work that was dedicated to his fellow countrymen that reflected upon the calamity, proposing how philosophy was a good remedy for soothing such grievous wounds. Later on, he is said to have written a treatise dedicated to Lucius Marcius Censorinus, who had commanded the earliest stages of the war, though what was his contents or purpose, we aren't certain. Others were more vengeful, as the much later writer Athenaeus claims that a number of Carthaginian survivors, or their descendants, approached Mithridates VI of Pontus, seeking him as a champion against the Romans, though this endeavor proved to be unsuccessful. Aside from the outburst of violence against the Carthaginians, the Romans did not extend their hostility towards the other Punic city-states that dotted along North Africa. For their support of the Roman cause, Utica acquired much of the territory formerly held by the Carthaginians, extending as far as the city of Hippo. The Senatorial Commission of 146 also decreed that this region would be turned into the new province of Africa Vetus, Old Africa, and would be overseen by a praetor, like what had been done in Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Many of the Punic communities continued to live under Roman rule, not only surviving but actively thriving in centuries to come, as it eventually became one of the most prosperous regions of the empire. Members of its aristocracy would become embedded in the imperial fabric, with one acquiring the position of emperor, the much later Septimius Severus, who was from a Punic family. The Punic language would indeed be used as a spoken tongue well into late antiquity, attested to by St. Augustine of Hippo, himself from the region, but also on plenty of inscriptions as well. Yet the Romans themselves would never let the memory of Carthage be anything but a blackened stain on the annals of history, as the many thinkers and writers that followed afterwards would justify the treatment of the mighty nation that once challenged the Romans over the mastery of the Mediterranean, which produced feared men like Hamilcar and Hannibal Barca. Most famously, the poet Virgil would weave the Carthaginians into the origins of the Roman people in his epic, the Aeneid, retroactively painting their rivalry as a form of manifest destiny, stemming from the unrequited love of the Phoenician queen Dido for the Trojan hero Aeneas, as the ending of Book 4 culminates with her committing suicide while issuing a curse that both their descendants, the Carthaginians and Romans respectively, would be doomed to go to war with one another until one destroyed the other. Despite being the chief instigators of the war, neither Cato the Elder nor King Massinissa lived to witness Carthage's destruction, having both died in 149 and 148 respectively, the last violent gasp of a generation that fought in the armies of Hannibal Barca and Scipio Africanus half a century earlier. Just as how his adoptive grandfather Scipio Africanus was the one who crowned Massinissa to begin with, Scipio Aemilianus was entrusted to oversee the division of the Numidian kingdom between Massinissa's three legitimate sons, Micipsa, Gulussa, and Mustanabal. Though of the brothers, Micipsa would find himself sole ruler after both of the siblings died of illness in 145. He would rule for the next 3 decades as a loyal ally of Rome, and to be raised along with his own sons, he adopted his nephew, Jugurtha, who would play an important role in the coming decades for the fate of the Numidian kingdom. As the architect behind the Roman victory, Scipio Aemilianus became a figure of widespread renown, just as his biological father Aemilius Paulus had done following the defeat of the Macedonians. Scipio organized a series of games as part of the celebrations, including throwing deserters to wild beasts for the amusement of the audience. He would host his triumph in early 145, an event that displayed the captured Carthaginian wealth, and like his adoptive grandfather, he too would receive the moniker Africanus in light of his conquest. Unlike the elder Scipio, Aemilianus would find much greater long-term success as a political figure over the next few decades, and will continually reappear in future episodes. With the end of the Third Punic War, this bloody chapter in the history of the ancient world came to a close. Rome had already secured its position as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean following the Battle of Zama, but the annihilation of Carthage in 146 gave a sense of finality over the whole affair. While I cannot help but be disgusted by the Republic's behavior in the events leading up to the war, it was the culmination of a series of conflicts that are without comparison in antiquity. Despite being smaller in size and wealth, the Carthaginians managed to seriously compete with the Romans on a level that none of the Hellenistic kingdoms ever could, and the number of lives lost during the Punic Wars on both sides is astonishing. Little wonder then that the Romans were so eager to maintain their supremacy, and Cato the Elder's slavering determination to wipe out the Carthaginians once and for all. Carthage was not the only city to be destroyed by the Roman legions in 146. Across the Mediterranean, the widespread pillage and looting of the famed Greek city of Corinth was taking place. Throughout the Third Punic War, an uprising in Macedonia had spiraled out of control, with its leader claiming the title of king and declaring himself the heir of the Antigonid dynasty. Anti-Roman attitudes eventually spread south into the Peloponnese, leading to conflict with the Achaean League that put an end to the idea of an independent Hellas. And when we next meet, we will discuss the Roman conquest of Greece.